Okay. So hi everyone. I have no one to introduce because I'm the speaker. So we're going to just get started. My name is Megan Leonard. I'm the face kind of behind these webinars. I'm a dressage trainer in the Bay Area of California. I'm a USDF Gold Medalist, and I'm actually currently halfway through the L Program, which is the first of the judging programs. We were just a few days away from the start of part 2, like literally I think 2 or 3 days when shelter in place started. And so hopefully that begins up again soon. As I said earlier, but not recording, this is going to be a little bit different, a bit more like a case study than actual instruction on clicker training. If you enjoy this, I can definitely bring in Kate, who uses clicker training more extensively in her program, who can answer your questions and bring you some more general information about it. But for today, I'm going to tell you what I did, what worked for TC, but keep in mind that your mileage may vary. So I wanted to put that out there. Okay, so let's get started, if I can use my slides. So I kind of believe that everyone has this one horse, this horse that kind of makes you question everything that you thought you knew about dressage, about riding horses, about horses in general, how horses learn. And my current horse, TC, is that horse for me. He's been an absolute blast to develop. He's super hilarious. He's in a great place right now. He's schooling 3rd level, getting his changes on really well. But he was a very tricky young horse for me, as many of them are. He's currently 9 years old. He was born in 2011. I started riding him in late 2014. He was about 15 rides under saddle at 3 years old. I did this because, or I started riding him because I had earned my gold medal in my retired Grand Prix horse, Rico. And I wanted something fun to ride, something that was mine, kind of, because I didn't own him at the time, but something that I didn't have to have any sort of agenda with. And so he was bred by a family friend, and I reached out to them, figuring that I would end up purchasing something at the end. I was in graduate school at the time, so I figured I'd purchase something maybe a year later, and TC would be that surrogate horse in between before I found my future horse. TC was a huge blast as a baby. His personality is absolutely hilarious. You can see the middle picture. I dress him up every year for his birthday, and he looks angry, but he loves it. And so I bought him in the fall of 2015. He promptly climbed up his panel fence at his new barn, and he fell off of it and then ripped the suspensory out of the origin site. He went to a rehabilitation facility until he was trotting for a good amount of time, and then he came back into my life. And rehabilitating a young, powerful horse is not super fun. 5-year-olds in general, not the most fun. And especially on rehab, he had to stay in a small paddock so he wouldn't run around, couldn't be turned out. And he had to stick with a small amount of work every day as he continued to heal. And this led to a lot of undesirable behavior, the most undesirable of which is bolting for him. Baby TC had shown a desire to bolt, but his gangly body didn't really let him do anything very aggressive. 5-year-old TC, however, was a different animal, and add to that he was cooped up, unable to let off any steam. There was no lunging him down or turning him out before riding. And not to quote Game of Thrones, but winter was coming. I began clicker training him on the recommendation from a good friend who you all know, Kate Little. I found that clicker training was incredibly helpful to get the bolting to stop. I also used it to reduce his spooking. And as we went into winter, I realized that I had no way of exercising him effectively without riding him. He's never really taken to side reins very well. He's half Frisian. And so he basically just retracts away and runs off with the side reins. So I clicker trained him to reach contact on the long lines. I moved on to teaching him to engage his hindquarters and lift his back while long lining. So I'm currently using clicker training to continue to improve the connection. That's just going to be an issue for him. You can see in these pictures, he has learned to reach to contact over time. And so I'm continuing to use that. It's just going to be an ongoing challenge for him. I'm also using it to put the piaffe on. I've got a video for you later about that. And then because of the piaffe, I'm also reinstalling the medium walk because all he wants to do is piaffe right now. So that's essentially my introduction to clicker training, and I'm going to switch and get a little bit more technical. I have 2 degrees in psychology. in research psychology. And so I wanted to bring, talk about what is clicker training and why we use it. And so the advantages of clicker training is essentially that we have it's very clear what is being reinforced. So the clicker essentially becomes reinforcing to the horse. So you're able to click exactly when the horse performs the desired behavior. It's a very consistent reinforcer. The click is very consistent. If you think, even if you kind of teach the horse that the words "good boy" means something, positive, what if you have a cold, that day? Your voice is going to change over time. And, if you're in a good mood versus a bad mood, it might be "good boy" or "good boy." And the horse, doesn't have that same consistency as the click, which is the exact same noise every single time. And then it's positive reinforcement, and positive reinforcement is shown time and time again to be more effective than punishment for when you're training animals, and honestly people as well. So what is clicker training? I pulled this definition off of Wikipedia of all places, and it says clicker training is an animal training method based on bridging stimulus, the clicker, in operant conditioning. The system uses conditioned reinforcers, which a trainer can deliver more quickly and more precisely than primary reinforcers such as food. So the basis of clicker training is conditioning. And there are two types of conditioning, both of which are utilized in clicker training. Pavlovian conditioning is learning through association, that's classical conditioning. And then there's operant conditioning, which is learning that occurs through reinforcements and punishments or behavior. I'm sure you've all heard of Pavlov's dogs. It involves the pairing of a primary reinforcer with a secondary reinforcer. And funny enough, Pavlov is actually studying dog salivary glands, not psychology or clicker or classical conditioning. He just sort of fell into it when he noticed that his dogs started to salivate, not when they were given food, but prior to then when they knew they were going to be given food. He called this psychic secretion, which I'm really glad that we changed the name of that because that sounds kind of gross. And he wanted to know why it happened. And that's where the bell kind of came into the operation. He would ring the bell and then feed the dogs, and the dogs would eventually associate the bell with food and would salivate when they heard the bell. To relate this back to clicker training, take the bell and replace it with a clicker, take the dogs and replace it with your horse, and take the food and replace it with some kind of treat or grain. Essentially, eventually, the clicker means the same thing to the horse as the treat does. And the clicker, again, is much easier to reinforce for the rider. You can pinpoint the exact moment the horse does something correctly rather than trying to quickly run over while you're lunging to shove cookies in the horse's mouth. The horse has no idea whether you shove cookies in their mouth because, they were looking at you and they wanted cookies, or because, they had done something earlier that you were reinforcing. So the other kind of conditioning is operant conditioning, which we use every day with our horses. Operant conditioning was fleshed out by B.F. Skinner. Essentially, it is conditioning operant conditioning is when a behavior is shaped by what follows it. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's a 4-part process, but I'm just going to start with the first 3 parts here because it's just a little bit easier to go about it. So the first part is the antecedent, but for our sport, let's just change that to aid. It still starts with A. The aid is a stimulus that indicates that you want the horse to perform a behavior, which is the second part, the behavior itself. So following the behavior, as we all know from growing up, we have consequences. Consequences can either reinforce a behavior or consequences can punish it. Reinforcing the behavior causes the behavior to occur more frequently and or with greater strength. Punishing a behavior causes the behavior to occur less frequently and or with weaker strength. There are 4 types of consequences, and then, there we go. Forgetting my slides. 4 types of consequences: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. They get a little bit confusing with the words positive and negative because those words don't refer to good and bad. They refer to whether you added or removed a stimulus. So reinforcement is anything that you do that increases the frequency and or strength of the behavior, and punishment is anything that you do that decreases the frequency and or strength of a behavior. So positive reinforcement is the addition of an appetitive stimulus after a behavior has been performed that increases the frequency or the strength of that behavior. Think of a horse finally nailing a clean flying change and getting a walk break and scratches on the wither. the addition of an appetitive stimulus, the scratches and the break, after a behavior, the clean flying change that you want to encourage to occur again. Negative reinforcement sounds kind of bad or weird, but we see it everywhere as well. This is the removal, the negative part, of an aversive stimulus after a behavior has been performed that increases the frequency or strength of the behavior. Think of a rider who puts their spurs into their horse's side, and when that horse moves forward, which is a desirable behavior, the rider takes the spurs away from the horse's side. The removal of an aversive stimulus, which is the spurs, that increases the likelihood that the horse will move forward. So they know that they can get those spurs out of their side. Positive punishment is another weird one. Punishment is not inherently positive, but it's what you think of when you think of punishment in general. It's the addition, which is the positive part, of an aversive stimulus to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. For example, TC loves to stand directly on top of me because we are best friends. When he crowds my space, I tap him with the whip on his chest. And this is the addition of an aversive stimulus, the whip, on his chest, that will hopefully reduce his desire to crowd me. I can tell you that that has not worked all that well. He still wants to stand directly on top of me at all times. Negative punishment is one we don't typically use with horses unless we're 8 years old and through tears tell our pony that just bucked us off that he is not getting any carrots later. It is the removal of a desirable or appetitive stimulus after a behavior that discourages that behavior. We use it rather infrequently with horses only because it's tough to set up where it actually discourages a specific behavior. TC isn't going to think that I'm not giving him a cookie after I leave the barn because I was unhappy with something he did earlier in the day. They just don't really think that way. Okay, so now that we are through the conditioning, hopefully you can see how clicker training combines two types of conditioning. By the way, all of these images are dogs because clicker training is commonly used with dogs, not as commonly used with horses. So, you know, it's up to your own interpretation how these images really work. But you can kind of see how clicker training combines the two types of conditioning. We're going to use classical conditioning to make the clicker an appetitive stimulus that you can then use as a consequence of a behavior in operant conditioning to make that behavior occur more likely to occur. So to clicker train an animal, we first have to acknowledge what primary reinforcers are effective reinforcers. To classify a primary reinforcer, think about what can reinforce an animal without a conditioning history or without a learning history. For example, I do my job in exchange for money, which is a reinforcer. But I had to be taught to value money because children raised in a society without money will not see any inherent value in having it. Children raised in a society without food, however, well, they'll probably die, but that got kind of dark. But children are born wanting food, they're born wanting water, they're born wanting shelter. And so are horses. They're not born wanting praise or wanting clicks. They don't know what that means, but they are born wanting this list, among other things. One thing that I thought was really interesting in doing some of this research years ago was the wither scratches. Those actually lower the horse's heart rate, and so the horse will work for that. And so I've actually used it, like if I'm at a horse show or if I'm working with a horse who's not clicker trained, I've actually used wither scratches as a positive reinforcement, and that works really, really well. Okay, so now we've gotten to reinforcement histories. So the rules for reinforcement. Behaviors that are reinforced tend to be strengthened and repeated. This is all very basic. Behaviors that are not reinforced tend to be weakened and eliminated. So early on, TC had a strong reinforcement history for bolting. Every time he bolted, it got him away from what scared him, and that encouraged him to repeat the behavior. He's not smart enough to understand that he didn't need to bolt in that moment. Like, he's a very sweet horse, but he's not a genius. So when he gets afraid of something, he thinks it's a life or death scenario. He runs away from it with all of his might, taking me with him. And he thinks, wow, like, that saved my life. I should do that again. Anytime I'm scared, like, that really worked. And so the reinforcement history for bolting became really strong in him. And it was much stronger than the reinforcement history for not bolting, because he's, again, not super smart. He was not going to experiment. He was not going to stick around with something that he thought was going to kill him just to see what would happen. So that became a stronger and stronger reinforcement history. So our first task in clicker training is, it involves the classical conditioning, and it's called bridge training. We're essentially creating a bridge between the clicker and the primary reinforcer that we're using. So I choose to use TC's grain because I wanted to not worry about how many cookies he was eating in a day. And I also don't use clicker training every day. And so I was a little bit worried about having his diet constantly changing. So I just use his grain. I can adjust the amount of grain he gets after his ride based on how much clicker training we did during the ride or during the workout. And so that worked really well for me. Other people have used sugar, have used cookies, you know, it's whatever motivates your horse. One of the worries that people have about clicker training, there's two worries that I hear frequently. One is that it's dumbing down, you know, horse training. Let me tell you that you can actually use it on people. You can look that up. It's actually rather hilarious, and it does work with people. But the other one is that it will cause the horse to mug you for food or to start biting. But the bridge training that I use that was recommended to me, that I use at TC, it really helps eliminate that response while also bridging the clicker to the primary reinforcer of grain. So I started with TC in his paddock, and he saw that I had grain, and I became very interesting to him. I didn't let him come after the grain. I just waited for him to get bored and realized that I wasn't going to give any of it to him. He was fairly rude, so it took a little while. And eventually I think that he heard a horse whinny in the background or something, and he looked away. And that's when I clicked, which he initially spooked at, and I gave him a small handful of grain. And he was suddenly really interested in me again, mugging me for more grain, getting in my space, all of that. Remember, he was 5. And so I remained patient. He got bored again, looked away, and I clicked and gave him grain again. And we did about 5 minutes a day for just a couple of days. And soon he had figured out that he only gets grain when he looks away. So he would see me coming with the clicker and my bag of grain and would not mug me and rather look away because he knew that was how he got the grain. And so by teaching it this way, I've taught him to not get mouthy or mug me for grain, but rather to give me space and wait for the click. So I have a bridge training example that I am hoping is going to work. This is Shauna. I'm going to link this video. She is absolutely fabulous. She trained all sorts of animals with clicker training. So she's going to go into this horse's stall. And again, if this video seems kind of funny, I'll send you guys the link afterwards. So that horse is obviously mugging her, and she has to kind of shoo him away, and he looks away. She clicks, gives him some grain. She says she stands back here by his shoulder. He looked away a little bit, and you can see it's not a lot of movement. Like the horse doesn't have to look way away in the very beginning. There he's looking back. She's ignoring him. She's just waiting. And then he looked away just momentarily. It doesn't have to be very sophisticated at first. And then she's standing there. He says, wow, you're very interesting. He looked away momentarily. She clicked. We can't hear the clicks. And then there he's like, oh, maybe if I just stand still and don't mug her, I'll get more grain. And he's starting to kind of understand that, you know, what the game is. And it takes a little while, but it's really only about 5 minutes a day for a few days, you know, especially with a very food motivated horse. I'll send you guys the full link so you can watch the full video with the audio if you're curious. Okay, so at this point, I was finished with the classical conditioning part of this training. TC knew that a click meant grain and was happy to work for the clicks because he knew that grain would follow. A lot of people start target training at this point, which is super interesting. I haven't done it yet. I'd really like to do it. I think it's adorable. I had a really specific goal though, so I didn't go that route. I'll eventually target train him. I think it's hilarious. But I moved straight from the bridge training to addressing TC's bolting behavior. My goal was to solidify the woe aid. And this comes from Andrew McLean's work, which Kate presented on in our second webinar. He talks about the bolting as essentially being, you know, a breakdown of the woe aid. And that leads to the horse no longer being under stimulus control, which is essentially a fancy way of saying that I had no brakes. Basically, the reinforcement that he got from bolting, such as getting away from perceived danger, was way more effective than the reinforcement he got from not bolting, which at the time was just not to annoy me. Like, he didn't care about that. He's like, I'd rather annoy you than get eaten by the scary thing that I'm running away from. So my goal was to increase the reinforcement history of the woe aid so that it could start to override the reinforcement history that he had from bolting. As I went over earlier, bolting very self-reinforcing. And so, you know, he was being reinforced by the lack of death that was happening there. And that's a pretty strong reinforcer, not dying. But TC really likes food, sometimes more than he likes avoiding dangerous situations. So I began to reinforce the whoa aid. I worked with him on the ground first, using my aid, saying whoa, and taking back on his halter to produce a behavior, a halt. And then I reinforced with a click and some grain. When he stopped, he was not allowed to immediately climb in my lap for the grain. The whoa needed to be appropriate. At first, he didn't get it, you know, very easily at all. But after doing it every day for a while, he started to slam to a halt more aggressively, even offering it when I even touched the rope, or when I said the word no, because whoa, you know, it sounds the same, because the whoa meant grain. So he may as well do it as much as you possibly can, because who knows when I'm going to want a whoa. And so from there, I started to school it on the lunge line, getting to the point where if I just shifted my weight a little bit or touched the line, he'd stop. And then I took it under saddle. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I use clicker training under saddle a little bit later. So his bolting behavior was getting way better with the clicker training. And I started to notice two things about the bolting. First, I noticed that when he did bolt after the clicker training, it took a while for it to go fully away. And even occasionally it is still his thing. You know, like every horse has sort of a tendency, but at this point, I think anyone really could stop him and he wouldn't get very far. So I first noticed that when he did bolt, it was way less aggressive. He didn't, you know, kind of downshift and leave for several circles. He would, you know, kind of just scoot off a little bit. And he didn't go nearly as far before I could stop him. Second, I noticed that the frequency went down. He didn't bolt nearly as often as he used to. For a very long time, and I still remember staying up late talking to Kate a few times a week about this, it just seemed like he bolted out of the blue without any warning. Like, it didn't even seem to happen because something scared him or because, you know, he just was super up that day or whatever. It just seemed to happen constantly without any warning. And then after the clicker training, it started to only happen when something really scared him rather than just randomly. So I kind of determined that this spooking was a secondary issue that I needed to address if I really wanted to get the bolting to go away, which I did. Because I would like for him to, at the very least, be a good boy for me to ride, if not an amateur, a junior in the future. So I noticed that his spookiness was what was kind of keeping the bolting alive. And I began clicker training for curiosity and relaxation. TC spooking has always been really interesting to me. I actually took him to 2 bomb-proofing clinics and he loved them. He thought that they were so much fun. Didn't spook once. You can totally thwap this horse with plastic bags and pool noodles. You can ask him to walk across mattresses and across water. He's totally fine with that. He's even fine with the cats running across in front of him, dogs barking and running at him, strollers and bikes passing him on the trail, and the resident chicken taking a dust bath in the arena. If there's a clear reason for what's going on, he's totally fine with it. Like, just not afraid of those things. But if the wind picks up and something flies around, or if something changes at the barn, or if a wheelbarrow has been sitting by itself instead of being actually handled by a barn worker, he's terrified of it. In these pictures, you can see that he's terrified of this round pen. I've never understood why. It's just a round pen, but he hates it. He's fine in it now, but he just hated it. And then he really hates sprinklers because no one's controlling them in his mind. So they just come on and they're very dangerous. So because TC spooking was not just a startle and would always lead to him wanting to put more space in between him, the scary object and himself, meant that that what was naturally reinforcing to him was to get away from the scary object, to put more space there. So I began to address that by trying to override that reinforcement history again with clicker training. So now he could choose between 2 reinforcers, the reinforcement he got from running away from the object versus the reinforcement that I was going to provide to him for taking a step closer to the object. So I started by leading him around my barn, waiting for him to become weary about something. I think the first thing that I found was he didn't like there was a tarp that covers the shavings, and he did not like that tarp at all because it was flapping a little bit in the wind, and he didn't understand why. So I made him stand still next to it, and I coaxed him forward, and he took one very hesitant step. And I clicked, and I gave him a treat. And we worked on that until he was standing on the tarp, and then we moved on. And I did this technique for a while. Every day we'd kind of go on a walk, and we would find scary objects. where clicks and treats would live in them for him. And so it got to the point after however long, I think it was at least a few weeks, if not a month or two, where every time he saw something that made him nervous, he would actually start to approach the item rather than run away from it, because he would get nervous. He would realize like, oh, I bet that thing has clicks and treats in it. So once I essentially got him to drag me towards things that scared him, I noticed that he still would stand stock still with his heart beating really hard. So I started to click for relaxation. So at this point, it wasn't good enough for him to stand near the object. He had to relax and take a deep breath or rest a foot or something. And that took a while at first, but soon he would start to take a deep breath, and I'd click for that. And that was really when I started to notice a huge decrease in his spooking. Once I was clicking not only for approaching the scary object, but for going to the scary object and then relaxing in front of it. And so he still hates wind to this day, but he's way easier to console. Definitely the spooking has both decreased in frequency and in strength. He'll startle, or if it's really bad, he'll do a little scoot. There was a big truck, we were riding in this terribly windy day after a day off, and a big truck kind of came in to like deliver shavings one day in the last like month. And he bolted for like 2 steps. It was like a spook. But gone, you know, are the moments where he's truly out of control. I can't think of a time where he's been out of control in the last like year or so. Knowing that clicker training was working, I started using it for more things. I had already done all the bridge training, may as well, you know, start using it for other things. So this was my progression for long lining. TC has a very Frisian neck. His tendency is to go the way he's going in this first picture, with his neck retracted, his hind legs stepping short, getting tight in the back. This is like one of the first days we were long lining. He didn't really like it at first. He's a very claustrophobic horse. Like I said about the lunging and side reins, he really doesn't like things that kind of make him feel contained. Not a huge fan of that, just sort of wants to retract away from that. And so the long lining, in the way that I thought it was going to go, is that it would give him more freedom, but he immediately was like, something's touching me, I don't like it. So I had to clicker train him to reach to contact. And you can see these first 2 pictures are of the same day. We're both wearing the same stuff. So by the end, he was reaching to contact. So I would aid him to bend a little bit more, but most of this beginning work was just sort of waiting. I remember vividly the first time he reached for contact, he actually went to blow his nose. And he had to put his neck forward and downward to do that. And so I clicked for that. And then I got a lot of voluntary nose blowing after that. So I clicked for it at first, trying to get that neck down, response from him. And then I started waiting until the nose blowing stopped, so that he wouldn't think that I just wanted him to like clear out his lungs when he was on the long lines. So slowly shaped the behavior until he reached down all the time. And then you can see in this last picture, which you can see is still very young here, I started to encourage him to reach out rather than down when I kind of lifted the long lines and added a little bit more whip. And then he, is starting to learn to lift through his back a little bit more, come up through his thoracic sling, that kind of thing. So I loved all of this because it meant that I could work him effectively in hand without having to ride him, which is very helpful again when winter was coming. He was young. This is, I think, that first winter. It was very helpful, again, when I was in a rush, or he actually stamped on my foot at one point. He's a very large horse, so I couldn't put my foot in a boot, so I couldn't ride him. After that, I started, playing on the long lines all winter, clicking for all sorts of things. Coming through the whip meant he would flex his lumbocecal joint and step further under for a few steps, so I would click for that. Continued our work with the woe aid, just shaping his behavior on the long line so I can continue developing him when I couldn't ride him or just didn't want to because he was 5 and obnoxious. So I mentioned earlier that I've used it extensively under saddle. I started doing it with the bolting. I told you I'd come back to that. So I reinforced the woe aid for my seat, my voice, my rein, and then we started working on spooking Undersaddle. I encouraged him to walk up to things. We started doing some work on reaching for contact. As you can see here, reinforcing any weight that he put in the reins. This is not a natural position for this horse. And he learned to stretch, and he's still quite good at it. You know, I just clicker trained it. I would put weight in the reins and click for, you know, him accepting the weight in the reins. And then I would slowly, an inch at a time, over the course of about 3 months, kind of allow him to stretch. When he reached for contact, he would get a click. So I didn't really get very much reaching at first. It was just like 1 or 2 steps, and then I'd stop him to give him treats. And then now he'll go for it. I mean, he'll go like this forever. He really likes it. So a lot of the questions that I tend to get about clicker training Undersaddle is how to coordinate it. Like, you're already holding both reins and the whip, maybe. So I'll often grab small cookies instead of the bag of grain. So for the most part, when I'm clicker training, I use like a fanny pack, because, you know, why not? And with grain in it. So with Undersaddle, I wear a back brace because for previous horses issues. And so I will grab a few small cookies and just put them in my back brace, or if you have pockets, instead of carrying around a bag of grain. But I have done it with a bag of grain too. Holding the clicker can be tricky, as is coordinating the click. What I do is I basically hold my reins kind of like normal, with my thumb on top, and instead of my thumb touching my rein, I have it holding onto the clicker, which is around my wrist, so that if I accidentally drop it, it's still attached to me. And then as I'm riding, it takes a little bit of time, but you can get pretty good at clicking while you're doing that. Because TC is, you know, a reformed bolter, I don't mind that he tends to stop when he hears the click, because the more that horse can stop in his life, the better, I think. So when it is coordinated very well, it's incredibly useful. And I told you that I was going to come back to the 4th part of operant conditioning, which is the discriminative stimulus. So I wanted to explain that, because that has been a very fascinating thing with TC. So discriminative stimulus is an indicator to an individual that a reinforcer is available. So we have our aid, then we have our behavior, then we have our consequence, which is in this case a reinforcer. So a discriminative stimulus is basically saying, hey, this reinforcer that you really like, that's around, like you can earn this. So think of it in this way. This is directly from my thesis advisor, who is a behaviorist. You're walking down the street and you're hungry, and you see a restaurant, and that restaurant is reinforcing to you because it means that you're about to get food. It's the bell that the dog salivated to. But then you see that the restaurant is closed, and it becomes far less reinforcing, maybe not at all, maybe punishing, because you're like, I really wish that place was open. But you're still hungry for food, but food is not available to you there. But if you see that the sign is flipped to open, the restaurant is immediately reinforcing again. So the open sign is a signal to you that reinforcer food is available. And that is the discriminative stimulus. To put it into you know, other words in terms of horses, think of the horse who acts up in the show ring because he's figured out that his rider doesn't have as much ability to correct him. The show ring itself, being at a horse show, seeing the court, seeing the judge, that becomes a discriminative stimulus for bad behavior, because the horse can, quote, get away with bad behavior in there. So I noticed that when I would grab the clicker and ride with it, that TC would be way more likely to offer me things that he's been reinforced for in the past with the clicks. Me holding onto the clicker became a discriminative stimulus for clicks, and therefore for grain and for cookies. So even though when I started doing it Undersaddle, I hadn't really done very much with the clicker Undersaddle, he saw that I had it and knew that clicks were available. So he worked harder for them. And I didn't have to click very often Undersaddle to keep him working hard for the clicks. So let's see. Currently, I'm doing a fair amount of clicker training in hand with TC. He's schooling 3rd level right now. A couple of months ago, time has no meaning, right, because we're in this pandemic, 2 lessons ago, my trainer essentially told me, get a piaffe on that horse. And I took her seriously. And one of the things that I was very aware of with TC is that he is you know, a highly nervous, like claustrophobic horse. And so what I did was I began at Liberty. He loves working at Liberty. I'm terrible at Liberty work. I just sort of tell him to do stuff and he just does it because he's a good boy and he thinks it's fun, not because I'm particularly good at it. But what I would do is I wanted to teach him that he needed to stay nearby when I put pressure on him. That he could, if he stayed nearby when I put pressure on with the whip, and in this case, it was mostly kind of, I had a piaffe whip, or I have one, and I tap him on the top of his butt, or kind of on the sides of his butt, just sort of tapping him lightly with it to put pressure on, because that he's been taught when whip comes on, whip means go fast away. And so I wanted to put some pressure on with the whip using my voice and clucking a little bit to him, which is what I was going to do for the piaffe, and I would click when he would stay nearby. So then I began working in hand for real. I used my trainer the first time to sort of help me coordinate everything, and then shelter in place started, so it was just me. So he now understood to stay close when pressure was applied, and that if he stood, you know, stayed with me, that he, and didn't try to blast through me to leave, that he was going to get clicks. So that's when I began to work in hand to develop the piaffe. We're just starting Undersaddle. I thought that I was going to have a ground person clearly by now, but I did not, and I did not change this slide. So I'm working on it myself, Undersaddle, which it's not going super well because I really need a ground person. One of these days we'll be allowed to have horses or other people at our barn. So what I want to do is show you a video that I've shared on my Instagram, but this is just TC learning piaffe. Keep in mind, this is 8 weeks into piaffe training. I normally wouldn't share videos of this early because it takes years to develop, but there I've got my whip. I'm mostly just clucking to him, and he's being a really good boy. And so the first one that we do, I don't put tons of pressure on him. I'm not really trying to improve it as much as I'm trying to just use the clicker to let him know that he's, you know, able to earn clicks. And then we're going to stand there for a second. I always let him stand afterwards, give him a pet, tell him what a genius he is, because, you know, he really shouldn't be able to do this with his conformation. And then we're going to start again, and I'm going to put a little bit extra pressure on him. Right now we're just working on, can I get it? Can he stay with me? Is it somewhat clear in the rhythm? You know, so I'm going to ask him like, hey, I need a little bit more, especially with my right hind who likes to be a little lazy. So I say, come on, dude, you know, and then he gets a click when he does it right, and a treat, which you can see my very fancy fanny pack. And then he spooks a little bit at my hand because I really wanted to pet him and he wasn't sure about that. You know, and then we just kind of hang out. He got extra because I felt bad for pushing him that much. Horse training's hard. And then I'm going to go back and do it again and again. So this full video is up on my YouTube channel and on my Instagram and all of that. And so the clicker training clicker training, the piaffe, has been super successful. He's been doing that for 8 weeks, a couple times a week for, I think we do like 3 to 6 of those little sets each time, maybe twice a week. Right now we're doing it once a week because I just, you know, can't really be bothered to do it more. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of what clicker training has done for me. You know, I've ridden with a lot of different trainers, and ridden with a lot of them who in the past who've emphasized that when a horse is doing something bad, they're meaning to be bad. You know, when your horse bucks, when your horse bolts, when your horse spooks, you know, he's meaning to be bad. He's trying to get out of work. You know, there's a lot of language that just isn't correct with horses. You know, my horse is an asshole. He knows what I want, but he just doesn't want to do it. He's not actually afraid of that thing. He just wants to get out of working. And, you know, these were things that I believed, you know, many years ago when I was growing up, because they were told to me, you know, by people that I respected. And clicker training, especially clicker training, really put everything into a different perspective. TC didn't bolt to be an asshole. TC bolted because bolting had a stronger reinforcement history than not bolting. TC didn't spook because he was trying to get out of work. TC spooked because spooking had a stronger reinforcement history than work did. You know, TC didn't refuse to stretch to contact because he knew what I wanted, but he just didn't feel like doing it. He refused to stretch to contact because there was no reinforcement history for it. So how was he to know that he was supposed to do that? And so with clicker training, TC's become just this incredibly easy horse for me to train. You know, he's only been doing the piaffe for 2 months, and he's already handling it so much better than my Grand Prix horse did. You know, He's not really got the conformation to reach to contact easily, but he does because it is being reinforced a lot. And I've noticed a difference in him as well in comparison to a lot of the other horses I've worked with. He's very playful under saddle. He's excited to work every single day. He knows that I'm going to be fair to him, and that if the answer is wrong, my first thought is never going to be that he's going to be deliberately bad, you know. And it's just been really fabulous to kind of go through this with him and learn. It's really shaped me as a trainer, I think, in addition to just helping me out with this singular horse. And I did mention that I've used it on a couple of other horses. My dad actually has a Tennessee Walker who only canters when he goes uphill and only on the left lead. And so I started clicker training him a little bit to get that canter in the arena, and he now canters in the arena, still only on the left lead. I don't ride him very much, but he canters. So I've got some additional materials. Shauna has some amazing books. She was the one that we watched the first video on. So you can read some of her books. The book that is You Can Train Your Horse to Do Anything. I have that book. It's really fabulous. And then she's got a ton of stuff on YouTube that you can watch as well, just like that video. And so I'll add those links to the recording and then also to the Facebook post and everything about this. So that's really great. Well, she does travel for clicker training clinics as well, if you wanted to eventually reach out to her. And again, if this is a subject that interests you, I can definitely set up another webinar that's more general about clicker training. I can recruit Kate to do that. And then that way you've got a little bit more information about how to do it with your own horse rather than just listening to this case study. So if you have any questions, please put those in the chat. If you need me to clarify anything, if you want to watch a video for longer, you know, do whatever you would like. And I'll leave this open for a little bit to let you guys ask any questions. And then this one, I talked quite fast, so we got really done quite early. Let's see. So do I have any plans to train TC at any other movements or behaviors with clicker training? So yes, I do. For the most part, I've used it for, like, I've not used it for lateral work yet. I've not used it for like the lengthenings or anything like that. I can imagine that it would help quite a bit with some of the other movements. I'm sort of waiting to allow TC to sort of tell me what he's struggling with. Some of the stuff he gets right away with traditional training, so I don't really feel the need to use the clicker training with those movements. But certainly the passage, I'm 100% planning on using that with the passage. I always put piaffe on first, most trainers do. And so we're definitely going to be doing that. And then I've, you know, like I mentioned, I meant to get a video of this, but I was not able to. I mentioned fixing kind of the medium walk with the clicker training. And I've definitely been doing a lot of that because all I want to do is piaffe right now. So yeah, the short answer to all that is yes, I definitely have more plans to train TC doing the other movements and behaviors with that. Okay, Janet's asking, is it possible for me to do the clicker training and my trainer not? Yes, I have ridden with quite a lot of trainers who I don't think even know that my horse is clicker trained. And my current trainer does, because I've talked to her at length about it. And when she helped me with the piaffe, I had the clicker. And some trainers, you know, aren't super into it, and that's totally fine. I'm very lucky that the trainers that I work with regularly are pretty supportive, even if they don't, you know, have me use it in lessons and all of that. So I firmly believe that, yeah, that you can totally use it on your own and then just go to lessons and take sort of traditional lessons. And a lot of the time we'll be doing something on a lesson that I feel like TC is really struggling with. And so then I kind of come home and I think about, like, okay, how can I, you know, reintroduce this with clicker training, you know, similarly. Okay, so Liz has two questions. Can you tell us again how many days you spent bridging the clicker So yeah, about 5 minutes a day or so. How many days? This was like 4 or 5 years ago, right? And so I want to say for TC, he figured it out pretty quickly. And so I would say like just a couple of days before it was usable for the WOE aid. You know, the longer you wait, the stronger the you know, connection becomes. But I was very eager. And so I would say that I started it, you know, essentially the day that I came out, which I think was like the second or third day where he wasn't like totally mugging me. That's when I started moving on. But just because like like you can totally overlap your bridge training with the other training. And so I continued to bridge train him while also doing the WOE training as well. Okay, would you say bridging is a better behavioral term, but has the same meaning as charging the clicker? Yes, I would totally agree with that. I don't know enough to know whether there's a slight difference between bridging versus charging. But it's essentially, yeah, that you're basically saying the clicker now has meaning. So whether you're charging the clicker so that it has meaning to your horse, or whether you're bridging the, you know, the food with the clicker so that the clicker has meaning. Yeah. Okay. Let me know if there's any other questions. Let's see. Okay, so Julia says, I have a horse that bolts 1% of the time, but is behind the leg 99% of the time. Oh, I feel you so much there. I'll definitely work on clicking when we approach scary objects. I'm also really interested in clicker training with him under saddle, but he already wants to slam on the brakes when I say good boy. Any suggestions for how to reinforce good behavior under saddle without having to stop each time? So that's something that is a little tricky for me because I've, again, always had a horse that, you know, I want to stop. My thoughts would be to, you know, make sure that the click is that they're only getting the reinforcement, like getting the food after the click when there's a good downward transition. So you may need to kind of abort mission and push them back, you know, into a forward gait. One of the other ideas that I would have is making sure that the downward transitions, like using clicker training on the downward transitions themselves, would be a really good thing to do, just to make sure that that they're more likely to, that the horse is more likely to give you a quality downward transition. You know, even, and if he wants to stop when you say good boy, maybe you could say good boy and then use that, you know, kind of push him through after that, to teach him not to do that, and then start to, you know, address the clicker, you know, the slamming on the brakes with the clicker by making sure that he's always, you know, giving you a good downward transition before he, you know, after the clicker and before he earns his treats. But that would be a fabulous question to bring to our, hopefully our next one, or our time, the one after that, where Kate's going to be here and she can answer way more like kind of specific for other people's horses. Because like I said, I've done this with TC and there've been a few things like the kind of slamming on the brakes with the clicker that I've not fixed because, you know, he's, I don't mind if he slams on the brakes. Okay, to clicker train through spooking, I would start in the ground and then use the clicker when he tenses up with pre-spook. Let's see. So yeah, that's a good thing. And yeah, and Nicole says the dog trainers have used bridging and charging interchangeably. So yeah. Yeah, definitely. So my suggestion is, if you guys find this, you know, really interesting, is that if, you know, you want to play for this full, you know, this week, if you still have access to your horses, and then bring any specific questions that you have to Kate's next talk. You know, I may do a poll or something to see like whether we want to fully, you know, whether we want to do another Andrew McLean style problem behavior with a focus on clicker training, or whether we just want to do another one on clicker training with her, because then you can kind of ask more specific questions that I feel not super qualified to answer. So I'm sorry about that. I'm definitely not an expert, but I thought it was an interesting topic, you know, that I've done a lot with my own horse on. So yeah, and let me know if there's any other questions. You can always reach out to me on Facebook, Instagram, like wherever, you know, everyone mostly has my email address too. Like, happy to answer any questions. I think there's a lot of us that are quite bored these days, myself included. So, okay, great. Yeah, so I think that's going to be it. We're done quite a bit early. I spoke way faster than I had planned. This is why it's different being in this seat. Let me pop the recording off. Stop recording.